Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Forever Forward podcast. And for those of you who do not know, we've done a bit of rejig in terms of our name. We were earlier known as the Facilities Management Times podcast, and we thought that since we were looking at wider areas of digital transformation, operations and maintenance, and smart buildings and whatnot, we thought that we ought to give ourselves a name which best does justice to what we're talking about. And today I have a very, very special guest with me, Justin, from UK, who've known for a little over a month, but we've had countless number of amazing conversations already, and which prompted me to reach out to him and say, hey, you would have to be on our podcast because a lot of people ought to hear him, his views, which are lateral, rational, and like a breath of fresh air when it comes to everything we talk about smart buildings. So I'll probably just hold back on that. Quickly let Justin say hello to the audience. Hey, Justin, would you like to say hello to everyone?
Yeah, hi there. Should I give you a little bit of background and context?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so look, I've worn a number of hats over my career, entrepreneur, consultant, contractor, and really across a number of sort of cross-cutting areas. So technology, sustainability, design, I guess, and marketing communications would probably be the kind of major ones, but that also how that marketing crosses over into design and innovation. So my actual academic background is human-centered design. And so I was approached recently to become this kind of somewhat bizarre title in some ways, but probably not in others, which is the smart building and sustainability advocate at a company called Ideal, who basically wanted to have kind of different kind of conversations with their customers, partly because what they do in the smart building space can be seen by some as really a commodity because it's a networking side of things. But actually, that's a really important and fundamental part of enabling smart buildings. So they want to kind of change the conversation away from it just being, this is just a whole load of switches and with feeds and speeds, into why what they do really matters within the smart building space.
To be very fair and honest, Justin, I don't think they could have found anyone else to be an advocate. So good job done by the recruitment person, whoever recruited you, mate. Must have been exceptional. But again, and to the audience, what struck me about my conversation with Justin is that he's probably one of the only few ones who's used concepts like, or who's spoken about concepts like jobs to be done and all the value proposition canvases and stuff while talking about everything that we have spoken about. And I'm sure you'll get to hear sort of more of it. And this conversation, and again, obviously Justin's made my life slightly difficult. He said, Umesh, we will not have set questions. We will have a theme. We'll see how we go from here. So the theme that both of us thought would be very relevant is to look at the entire context setting of what smart building. Again, there's so much being spoken about, and I'll probably be the last person to be talking on smart building. So I'll let Justin do the talking, and I'll probably be only asking the questions. But again, drilling down further from a very broad level to what we see as a very great opportunity and a risk as well, but more of an opportunity, which is the application of it in the environment of brownfield projects or retrofit environment in that sense. So firstly, Justin, my first question, and this is something that stuck when we were trying to define or understand, because smart buildings has a lot of definitions, and we don't have to do a job of trying to add another definition, which might just end up confusing people more than convincing them about smart buildings. But you use the word connected as a better representation of the ecosystem. Why would that be so?
Well, I think, look, one of the things which happens when you've kind of worked in other business areas is you can see patterns, both of problems and solutions. Now, And one of the first things that I do when I look at a new area is look at the terminology. So if you look
Mm,
at smart buildings, that's not the only term being used to describe them. There's intelligent buildings, autonomous buildings, and generally those terms come from people who have some axe to grind about why it might be called one thing or the other.
mhm,
So one of the things that I have seen in other areas, so for example, in the social impact space, there's a very famous model called the ladder of participation,
mhm,
okay, which kind of almost shows this kind of layers of or levels of how much participation you can have in co-creation, collaborative innovation, social innovation, etc.
mhm,
And in a way, it kind of goes from the most necessary thing you need to have any actual real participation to where it's kind of perhaps relatively trivial to where it's like totally people are engaged in the process.
right.
And there are other models which show maturity models or progressions, famous one being the experience economy, which shows a progression of commodities to goods to products to services to experience to transformation. So suddenly those are kind of lenses I use to look at something. And I'd have to say that I'm not sure if connected building is the kind of end point, but I
Mm,
do think it's the starting point. And that's often missed in the conversations around smart because, if you have a maturity model or a ladder of, or, some form of ladder or some form of progression, where is starting place in that? I mean, it isn't, a building being full blown AI autonomous being, which has which can run the building without any of us being needed to do anything. So,
mm,
the first starting place seems to me is you have to connect everything up because unless you connect everything up, and by that I mean the operational technology, the IoT, physical devices, digital devices, etc., there's no data being
mm,
taken to any of the platforms which are able to analyze it and
mm,
then potentially automate any of that technology to bring all the things but everyone says smartness is about, like more sustainable buildings, healthier buildings, better understanding of usage of buildings, better provision of customer experience, etc., or user
mm.
tenant experience. So the starting place has to be how you connect everything up, and therefore I don't know if necessarily connected buildings is the best term for your destination, but it is definitely where you have to start.
But I think it's
That
a get of obviously, it did not come to my mind when you first spoke about it. But right now, when you probably stressed about this point again and explained it, I think it it's common sense. But to be very fair, it's like it doesn't strike you, right? You say when we talk about smart buildings, we often talk about the end outcome, or we have the end outcome in mind, and which can be very different for different set of individuals or stakeholders in that sense. But when we talk about connected and lay down that you may have any outcome in mind, but the number one thing to start is to be able to connect the dots or the infrastructure and so on and so forth. So, which kind of makes things relatively simple, not in absolute proportion. But then the aspect, could you further break it down? Like when let's say if someone were to use this concept of looking at connected buildings to obviously they should be knowing on what are the outcomes they intend to drive, because the outcomes could be very different. How does this change in the context of you wanted to say something? You want to add something?
Yeah, I
Sorry.
was just going to say, look, I think it's kind of relatively simple because I'll use Star Trek as an analogy, but all the
Mm,
stories are about what happens with Captain Kirk and the bridge, okay? The
mm,
only time the engine room is ever brought into it is when the dilithium crystals aren't working anymore. And I think that's a bit like smart buildings because what excites everybody is all the kind of apps and platforms and what you can do with all of that. And that makes absolute sense because in a way that's the bit that is very tangible. You can see the dashboard and its representation of what the delivery might be to the
mm,
tenants and
mm,
users.
mm.
But none of that is possible without some of the other stuff underneath it, and that bit is often hidden and not thought about. And so there's a kind of distortion a glitch in the matrix or whatever. There's a sort of distortion field around smart buildings because all the energy and enthusiasm and excitement is about one end of it, but that end of it isn't possible without the other end of it. And the thinking can often become not joined up because of that, because it's, what are we, it's all about, and rightly so, any human-centered design or, user-centered design has to start by putting yourself in the shoes of who it is you're designing for. So absolutely right, but it's about outcomes and all of those things that we talked before, jobs to be done, pains, gains, challenges, all of those things that you're trying to do. And I guess that's another thing which is kind of problematic from those people in the world of IT too, because traditionally they've been in the business of selling products, hence what I said before about switches being about feeds and speeds. What support count, how do we IP address each thing which connects to it, what's the speed going through it, things like that. But actually, and when you're in the smart building space, and particularly when you're trying to offer services around that kind of core, central, common, converged, integrated network, again, another area where there's about 20 different terms to describe, is that you're having to think about outcomes. You're having to think much more about solutions, not about products. So it's inevitable, but from what I've seen in the relatively short space I've seen in it, that those kind of two sides aren't as kind of joined up as they could be.
So, I mean, let's talk about the connectivity between the two. When you said, one is the outcome, which probably you're one most people are excited about. But I'm assuming thinking about connectivity and the connectivity from the perspective of thinking about it as a connected building or as a connected infrastructure must be very different when you are doing a greenfield versus a brownfield, sort of a retrofit environment. What's your take on that?
Well, you beat me to it because that was going to be my next point. And I think the reason why this connected thing is, and that progression is important, because look, here's what the pros and cons of the greenfield or new build, as it's often called in the construction area, is that in some ways everything has to be done at the onset. You have to think it all through. You're going to be buying a huge amount of new plants and other operational technology. You got to think about the devices, you got to think about the network, you got to think about that all being connected up, and that all being connected up in a kind of schedule which maps on to the construction plan of works, because there's other tradespeople going into the building trying to do their bit, whatever bit of them mechanical and electrical plumbing they're supposed to be doing, you're having to do all of this in and around them. So it's much more logical, ordered, but the downside is those specifications are often written 2 or maybe more years before the building actually goes live. So at the point it goes live, often the technology in it, unless there's been some more iterative thinking throughout the process, was specified quite long before that building went live. Okay. And therefore, and then it's really expensive to have to change anything by then, because you've just made this huge investment in putting that infrastructure in place. But then, so I think in the brownfield or retrofit, but everyone's talking about that connected piece. So inevitably, a new build or greenfield project is going to be connected at the onset, okay, completely, because it has to be, if the ambition was to be smart and get one of the different scores which are out there, whether it's platinum this or whatever that's the ambition, and everything has to go there. So that's inevitably, it's going to be connected. But in the brownfield retrofit scenario, that is your starting place. We have to think about how we're going to make it a connected building first before we ever think about it being smart, autonomous, or intelligent, because we probably have existing assets already here, and there's
Right.
probably a whole load of other assets, digital ones, sensors, etc., which we need to deploy to help give some of those kind of tenant and user experience improvements, air quality monitoring, density monitoring, maybe some of the energy optimization might not be completely all there at the onset, because that's about getting information from all the plant and all the different operational technology. But there are things you could be doing at the beginning, and one of the things you're going to have to be doing is thinking about the converged or common or integrated network, and how you're going to plan and how you might scale that, because that's going, and not just that, but also how you do the edge, or a lot of people call it different things, but above the network is the edge or data integration layer, often through platforms like Tridium's Niagara, to help get the data to go from the different devices to whoever platform it is that is going to be sitting at the other end of it. So all of that needs to be thought through. But what tends to happen is that someone commissions the new CCTV system, okay? And with the new CCTV system, they buy a network. And because they've invested that money in that network, that money which could have been used from that work could have gone towards making a network that everything could have connected to. So suddenly
not just the CCTV.
Yes, that could have been used for everything, but they've just invested in a network just for the CCTV. So all that budget has suddenly been pushed away. So there's a kind of much more upfront thinking and about like, okay, we know where we want to get to, because that's whatever we're going to call the next layer, or whatever we're going to call the progression from connected to smart,
whichever state.
And you're heading in that way, but you're going to have to start here and start there. So if you're thinking about any kind of refresh of any operational technology, or even network refresh, so information technology, that is the point at which you start saying, okay, we need to get a lot more people in the room than just the IT person or the building management person, and start putting them together to try and plan this so that we can start building a roadmap, seeing what assets we have, seeing what assets we will, physical and digital assets we will need. So I think it's a very different way of going about things than it is with the and I think we discussed it before, is, I mean, I don't think it's completely true, but it's a kind of useful kind of analogy or metaphor to kind of describe it. But because construction projects are waterfall for a reason.
Exactly, that was what I was coming to. That was a great explanation.
Yeah, because so buildings don't fall down. That's why you do a waterfall project management, like any engineering project. You don't want bridges not meeting in the middle.
Right.
So you have to have, you don't want some agile thing where, oh, we're going to maybe get here. So, but so in a way, what happens with the information technology or ICT infrastructure is it kind of follows that waterfall methodology by just virtue of necessity of what else is going on the construction project. Not necessarily after practical completion, but up until
makes sense.
Yeah,
makes sense.
And you so in the brownfield retrofit, I think there's a much greater opportunity to be more agile, because again, they can potentially suffer from the same problem about specifications being out of date by the time something happens. So let's say you do an initial thing with some plans, or by the time you've installed that and it's all operational, then things will have moved on anyway. So you need to be able to keep kind of doing the iterations, evolving it, etc., etc.
So Justin, if you were to take a step back, I mean, like you on the greenfield versus brownfield, I remember in our conversation, you made a very, a comment that kind of, again, is simple but powerful, is that when everything is in the construction stage, it has to be delivered. So there are specifications for everything. There's like a zero room for any deviation. There is like, really. So if the network has to be in a particular way, the devices have to be connected and stuff like that, all have to be as per specifications which have been drilled down. But when you look at the brownfield, the challenge then becomes is there in greenfield, the number of stakeholders were limited. You had probably the company that was doing the construction, the company that owns the asset, and there's a transfer handhold process. Very little of it is like, even in the handover process, facilities management companies for large infrastructure don't really come into play. They've been trying to shout at the top of their lungs. They get us involved while the handover is happening, but I don't think anyone ever listens. That hasn't happened. But as soon as you come into the brownfield or retrofit environment, you have a way more number of stakeholders. All of a sudden, you have companies which are into applications or apps, or companies which are into hardware, or BMS companies, or facility management. So you have a way more different stakeholders. Then just a question for you, for a company like yours, which wants to have a more broad conversation, I mean, how do you even bring all of them together? Like, what do you think is good?
Well,
Because at the
I
end of the
mean,
day, just one final point before you is because as you said, your work essentially is the starting point, but one needs to know where they might want to go, and there's just too many people in the room now.
Okay, so two things. One is the point you made about the FM, which I think is really interesting, because in the past, most of the specifications are coming from what we would call building consultants. So there may be a division of a engineering company, or potentially something like that. I'm not going to name the names, but there are a lot of them, and
Correct.
some of them have smart building consultancy teams within them. Okay, so that's where the specifications. But you're now seeing people who used to work in those kind of building consultants setting up similar consultancies in the FM companies, without naming names, to do exactly that. So basically, the FM, and we're talking about from the four bigger ones that everyone knows, they are having special digital advisories, and now they're arms, and now they're having smart building consultancy arms within them, which I think is trying to address this problem. Is, look, at some point the FM or building services company is going to be having to manage all of this. Therefore, it makes sense for who's ever specifying it to be, at least have involved, if not doing the specification, come from that side of things. And I think it will end up being horses for courses about who decides whether they go with the traditional the traditional route of building consultants, or they go with this kind of new breed. But I'm beginning to see emerge. But I mean, I'm only beginning to see that emerge within the time I've where they're truly writing the actual specifications that people like Ideal receive. In answer to your other question, how do you do with the multiple stakeholders? Well, I can tell you how I've been trying to deal with
Perfect.
it.
That makes sense.
This is part of it, really. I'm having conversations with you. You're on. That I've met some other people in the cloud space and app space, and had conversations with them. And you may have seen on LinkedIn, but I hosted
event.
I didn't host it. I basically curated and emceed it, but the kind of underlying principle behind the curation was, how do you get people from across the industry in one room to come and speak to each other? So that had investor developers, it had building landowners, it had construction companies, it had building consultants, it had MEPs, it had BMS people, it had platform people, all in this. And I think it may have even had passive infrastructure, structured cabling type people. And it had a major IT vendor behind the kind of ICT products, behind the network and other aspects of smart building. So, the part of the purpose was at least, how can you facilitate a conversation? Now, clearly that's on a very small scale for one, company in that whole ecosystem. I mean, I think some of the certification bodies would argue that that's what they're also trying to achieve. And in a way that their certifications are the kind of embodiment of that kind of interchain, the conversation that they help facilitate and research and analysis around that they do. That's and given that a lot of people are getting certified by those things, maybe that's the proof in the pudding. So I think that's one of the things. What I would say is I haven't really seen anyone as yet produce a kind of structured blueprint, for a kind of retrofit or brownfield type opportunity scenario, whatever you want to call that particular thing. And I think that's partly because there's never going to be one size fits all approach to it. But I do think you could say, here is a kind of progression route that you need to be thinking about, like auditing what assets you have, working out what the outcomes are that you're trying to achieve, working out what it is that you could be doing without having to do major refreshes on all your equipment, just by using, a scalable common network, new sensors and devices, power over Ethernet, all of those kind of things, which will give you some kind of future proofing and be able to bring more things on board as you go forward. How much can you ensure that open protocol is part of whatever it is that you're doing, and all of those things, MQTT, which you probably know well about for your platform. So the all of that kind of things, I think, and look, I'm not a project manager, so I understand journeys and personas and the jobs to be done, how you would map an ecosystem, how you would do priority mapping on all of the different needs and wants of the particular user group. And look, and it's, I think we touched upon this before, about all the different platforms out there. I mean, I'm just going to give 3 categories. There's probably more of them, and, you'll feel free to throw more of them at me. But there's certainly those which are more focused on tenant and user functionality. They're often apps which people have on their mobile. Okay, there's often a platform sitting behind them. There are those which are much more designed on estate management, those people who have large portfolios and lots of buildings and assets within that estate or portfolio. And then there are those which are much more about building operations and management, like when are we going to have to service the elevator? When are we going to have to do fire checks? When are we going to have to do this? Which devices are actually on, which has fallen off the network? Is that the network's fault, or is that the actual whatever it is, the fire system itself, or, something much smaller than that, the fob device and on building A, no one can get into the building or whatever, those kind of things. So, or security or CCTV, whatever. So that's, and there are people who want to bring, put in, kind of one size fits all solutions which cover all of those. And I think, as we discussed, there's a sort
Fog.
Well, there's a problem there. I mean, it's a bit like a Swiss Army knife, isn't it?
I mean, but for interest of everyone, the SPOG that probably we're talking about.
Sorry, the SPOG.
Yes, is the single pane of glass view that a lot of white papers suggest as the sort of be it all strategy. So I think so we ended up having. So would love to know what you share with everyone what you think of that SPOG, and again, does it apply to all, and what could be the SPOG at all?
Well, I mean, maybe in some comms room or command center in some sort of, where everyone's sitting looking at the dashboards in one place. But I don't know. I mean, I think it's about whose job is it and what jobs to be done do they have? Is the person who looks after, who's responsible for the culture and community of the building, and
Right.
therefore much more kind of user and tenant focused, are they looking at the same things as the person who's head of building operations, okay,
Mm,
or the person
mm,
who's head of estate management? And is
mm,
is that one role
mm,
really, or several roles? And therefore, are they going to need different views, depending on what their jobs are? That also means there's different personas that they're having to think about, or, users that they're thinking about. And so my take in whatever area of solution development that I've ever been in the past is you always end up with this situation between enterprise wide versus best of breed, and that being a kind of strategic decision that someone who makes the commissioning has to think about. Are we going to get one enterprise wide platform because we have
mm.
one SLA on it, we have one billable person, or are we going to get several things because those are best in their class? Now,
Hmm.
I'm not going to say that someone who
One's better
offers
than the other. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that there are some problems in that, because why best of class exists in the first place is often because the people making that platform better understand the users they have been developing for. It's as
Hmm.
simple as that. You know,
Hmm.
if they didn't understand that, then they wouldn't be a best in class solution.
True
Okay.
that.
So
True that.
it's always the case that, so anyone who offers a one size fits all would have to probably demonstrate that really they do, each one of the different components they offer is at least as good, if not better, than the
The
best
best
in
in class
breed for the
indeed.
British, and that would mean that they would have to basically really got under the skin in each one of those different areas of the people using those different things. Now, I'm not saying that's impossible, but it's always going to be, you know, and I don't know about smart building because I don't know enough about the people offering those, who offers those solutions and whether they can do it. But my take in out from other business areas is
Just
the one
learning, just the learning from elsewhere, and not
yeah, it's
necessarily.
just that
Yeah.
like they often are a bit like Swiss Army knives. They have all the
Hmm.
different tools, but not one of those tools is as good as that single tool itself. Okay,
Makes
so
sense.
the knife on a Swiss Army knife is not as good as having a separate knife. Neither is the screwdriver, neither are the scissors.
Hmm.
Probably the only thing on a Swiss Army knife which is as good as one which is is the toothpick. So um so I think that's the problem about one size fits all, and potentially now also a single pane of glass doesn't necessarily have to be one solution. It could be something which brings in data from different solutions and presents them on a dashboard which the user, the different users, stakeholders within the organization have asked for, because
Hmm.
whoever's asking for the sustainability reporting thing may need very different needs to the person who wants to make sure that the lifts are all maintained properly and operational. So it's
True
kind
that.
of so there's no reason why you couldn't have a someone, let's take in a different area monday.com, for example, which pulls in other people, allows openness to be able to use other applications in the overall application. Like I could easily see something like that happening in a kind of smart building space where someone says, look, we're going to create a platform which allows other people's
But then,
platforms.
but then the point is, yes, a platform cannot be a culmination of applications within your own platform. Like it then really has to open up when you
Yeah.
look at it. And that's, but yeah, got your
And
point.
I
And
think
that's
you're
where it makes
starting to
sense.
see that, the term marketplace happening, with different people. I mean, the whole Tridium Niagara framework is built on that, isn't it? With
Hmm.
their
Hmm.
database and things like that. It's
True that.
open. So maybe you'll see more things like that around the different applications out there. And there will be as I say, there will be this kind of divide between enterprise wide versus best in class or best of breed or whatever you want to call it. I mean, that's how I can see that all shaking out over the next few years or whatever.
Hey, thanks, Justin. I mean, appreciate your views on a single pane of glass, and I completely agree that that again, it's going to be too premature to rule anything out. I mean, given the way solutions are developing and the kind of stakeholders that are getting involved, we might see a lot of innovation happening. But I agree that the way just my perspective on smog, the way smog's been defined is probably not what it should be, and not what it would be. It would really have to be really, really open. So what I'm trying to say, it cannot be the Apple way where you say my OS, my applications, and I control. That's not a definition of being open. Is how I would look at it really
Yeah,
needs. Yeah.
and look, here's another thought, because back in the day, when financial technology, or at least the kind of area I was in, was called treasury technology,
Hmm.
there were companies like SunGard which helped consolidate the market by basically acquiring a whole load of best of breed players who did a specific financial instrument or areas of
Right.
trading, whether it was commodities, derivatives, or whatever. So there's no reason in principle, but some big player may come along who might start doing that kind of consolidation, where they'll say, right, we're going to analyze the market, see what how it slices and dices,
Hmm.
and create a best of breed platform from the people within the market
Makes
who
sense.
already have best of breed platforms, and they would have the money and investment to be able to do that. So it's not like it's theoretically impossible. I just think unless you have that kind of scale and money
Hmm.
behind you, it's going to be more difficult, because
To pull it
you
off.
probably don't have the resources to really dig deep enough into each different kind of cluster of people that you're trying to develop part of your solution around. So that's really my take on it. But historically, if you look at other sectors,
Hmm.
people have kind of worked out how they solve those problems.
Right.
So either through acquisition or research, and their own research and development and innovation, depending on how much it's going to be not built from here or not.
True that. True that. No, that helps. But I go back to one of the points that you mentioned earlier when you said that one of the things you are looking at doing, and a part of your role is to be able to strike different conversations, or let's say broader conversations with your customers. And again, when you spoke about the fact that there isn't a lot of conversations, independent conversations happening out in the market when it comes to retrofit sort of environment. Just wondering, out of all the stakeholders, who could potentially take the lead, or is it like one? And again, when I say who, I'm not meaning a company, but who, as in which of those stakeholders could have a broader say or interest, according to you so far, what you've seen, and say, fair enough, it lies in our best interest to be able to sort this and bring everyone together. Could there be someone
Well,
doing that?
I mean, at the moment, I think that that's a kind of ambition that some of the certification bodies are trying to bring about. I mean,
Hmm.
there are some, networks out there who are trying to do things like this,
Hmm.
and there are some kind of, I can't remember there's a network kind of based out of New York, I think, was trying to do something like this. And then there's a few kind of network, community, whatever you want to
Hmm.
call the group. And then there are things like I don't know if that's necessarily their kind of remit, but they do have a kind of educational remit. So Nexus Labs is a kind of example. Smart Building Boot Camp is another.
Example. Yeah.
Not necessarily that's their necessarily, sorry for that tautology. It's not necessarily, but that is their core remit. But there's no reason in principle why that
Why they come? Hmm.
couldn't be part of what they do. However, the most interesting discussions I've had personally, and that's because I'm not necessarily involved in those communications and certification bodies and educational communities or whatever so
Hmm.
much, has been far more by informal networks,
Hmm.
and who seem to have a sort of Fight Club rule, but the first thing is you don't talk about Fight Club. But
Outside the fire.
I mean, not because there's anything untoward going on, it's because it is far more informal. They're
Makes
meeting,
sense.
and I guess, so this comes to the heart of what I do, I think, because I think a lot of people think I'm some sort of network harvester or, lead gen guy or content guy or whatever. I mean, actually, what I really
Perhaps
do,
all rolled into one.
yeah, probably, and, forgive me, I have sinned. I'm a recovering network harvester. But there's a much broader purpose behind that, and that's called market engagement. Really, I'm going to be
Makes
starting
sense.
to write some posts about it, and so clearly someone's paying me. They want something in return for that. So, and but however, there's some other things which come out of that, and I suppose because one of the areas I've been in, and I actually co-wrote a book around it, looking at it strategically, a lot like the kind of conversations that you and I have been having, and I've been having others, looking at the naming of it, looking at the layers of it, looking at the problems that are being solved, trying to think about it as a phenomena or an ecosystem and things like that. And that was the content marketing space. So part of what I do is connected to that. But part of the problem with that approach is it's become part of the very problem
It was sorted
to solve, because everyone is a thought leader now. Everyone is putting out a white paper, and it's this whole concept of we are experts, here's our expert opinion, but everyone can see that's just the setting out of a stall. Okay, it's just more marketing collateral, editorialized or presented as research or whatever.
Right.
So its currency has been lost, or its value. And so, and partly because the way its success is measured is on the same way that what it was trying to be an antidote for, which is advertising. Its success is measured on how much attention it generates, not necessarily
the outcomes it sort of
the
kind of ends up.
insights and intelligence which comes out of the process. What have we actually learned by having this conversation, running this event, putting this report together? Has that strategically helped our business or not? Understand the market we're in, understanding the needs and wants of the users, or is it just our success is judged because loads of people talked about it and said this is really clever? So I'm not saying all those things like the profile building and reputation building aren't benefits or useful or important, but actually what's really useful about it is the insight, market intelligence that comes out of the facilitation and doing it. So, does it matter how many people actually saw the output if the insight from that conversation was generated fundamentally helped you rethink or reshape your business because it was something that you had failed to see or understand that was coming down the line? So it's
how
not
do you
necessarily, it's like I had this conversation with that person, they gave me this insight, and that totally rewired my thinking about this thing because I hadn't seen
out
that
of that way.
So I mean, and that's more so in a way it's kind of like putting research back into marketing, and that becoming more of a strategic business function rather than just a promotional business function, because it's about, these conversations, whether they're one-to-one, round tables, informal, in networking, around facilitated by some talks and other things going on. Those are kind of the real currency, I think, because that's when you really get to understand what it is that people are trying to achieve, what are the jobs what are their jobs to be done, what are the problems and what are the challenges they're facing, because then you can think about, okay, I hadn't thought about that, here's a potential solution, and that probably change my priority mapping of what are the key challenges that those people are facing. But I guess that kind of joined upness, a more holistic way of thinking about things, is problematic for a lot of organizations because, you know, although they may talk about, you know, autonomy and things like that, organizations are about, we're paying this person to do this particular job, or we're paying that person to do that particular job. And therefore it's harder to kind of see, well, actually, that thing's much more joined up. It cuts across different, you know, business functions in our organization, you know, from strategic thinking, new product development, marketing, sales, all of these
All of
things.
that. Oh,
You know,
makes
so
sense.
I think that's kind of like, so yes, you can formalize it, but the formalization of it makes it into a framework or something of which you're then selling. And at that point, you have an axe to grind around the thing you're selling, as opposed to it, that all that research and intel just being more informal. I mean, look, there's neither of us here are trying to sell each other's products, you know, so we're having a conversation because we're generally interested in this, and having conversations with other people in the ecosystem helps us understand or
What's
changes
happening on,
changes the way we think about these things. So I don't know, I mean, you know, that's why I kind of, a lot of this put my kind of design thinking hat on around all of this, is it's kind of like, in a way, just a kind of extended part of the discovery phase or deep dive into the space you're in. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, it's interesting because it reshapes my thinking about, you know, and on a very kind of, you know, on one level, that's about the SWOT, isn't it? You know, what are the threats? What are the opportunities? If those are threats and opportunities, where are the strengths and weakness in terms of responding to those? But it's also about, you know, well, actually, the real problem for construction companies is this, or the real problem for investors, developers is this, or the real problem for building landowners is this, you know. And therefore, you know, if we're framing what our solution is, it has to take that
into account,
bear
the
that
problem
in
into
mind
account.
and be part of how the messages is and what the value proposition is and all of those things. So, you know, and it's funny, I've never seen those things as isolated. And, you know, in the startup space, if you look at a company like Strategizer, who make the books like the business model canvas, the value proposition canvas, that's all integrated. You know, you start with a business model environment, then you look at the business model, then you look at the value proposition, then you have a whole load of tools about how that's rolled out. And, you know, some of those tools include looking at the team, behind.
They're kind of deeply interconnected. You kind of, one leads to the other.
Yeah, and
for
then
you to
not,
build
and
the
also, you know, and there's a whole load of diagrams from the kind of lean startup, which kind of join the dots between design thinking, lean UX, agile development, growth hacking, and they don't, those diagrams join the dots between all of those things. They're not seen as, so it's not like I'm the only person who's thinking like these things need joining up. There's people much
I
more
think,
kind of.
No, you're quite correct, Justin. I mean, I think what you say is obviously the essence of it. I mean, I think you rightly said that today, obviously, and people within our own rights. I mean, I'm sure, you know, when you say there are a number of thought leaders, which is a good thing that today, I think we're in a democratic environment where at least you don't need to be really big to be to share your piece of your opinion or what you think. But it's just that, you know, I mean, people have also, with so many people sharing their own opinion or what they think, it has also become that the people listening to it or reviewing it have become wiser, and that's where I think the best form of content that wins is the content that is, as you rightly said, is not even in its any form designed to sell, but designed to educate. And then if selling has to happen, it happens. But fair enough. I mean, I think the two of us can do what we can, which is to have a conversation, which we've had. But I'll go back to one, you know, last forward-looking question for you. You've from you. So you've spoken about the, you know, as a recap as well for everyone. Like, we've spoken about why it's not a challenging situation. So it's not either or, but why probably starting from a connected and sort of thinking process helps people start, because it's like the start, you're very certain of where you want to start. The end might change or influence your and it's best to look at progression, as you said, and that fundamentally is what the bigger opportunity retrofit environment presents us with, and so on and so forth. We've spoken about that. What's that one thing you are incredibly excited about, one or maybe two, about this space, and probably if we can limit to retrofit environments for 2023?
Yeah, look, I mean, I need to be careful because it sounds like I think it says you should start with the network and connecting things. I'm not really saying that, because I do think you have to start with outcomes and things like that. But to be able to get to those outcomes, you have to start with
That's the fundamental. Makes sense.
You've got to connect things up. So, I just wanted to clarify that. I don't know if okay. There's two things exciting me or interesting me. I mean, what I think exciting me about the retrofit is there's a lot of talk about it, but far few case studies out there have been anyone who's done it very well. Okay. And so that probably needs to come out a bit more. What I am excited about is, like, a lot of people are talking about it. I think actually there's quite a lot of, from my experience of speaking to different people across the thinking is actually quite divergent at the moment. And I think that's potentially a problem, and one that needs to be solved, because if there's a lot of divergency, it's only going to create market confusion about
and
what
when you just this is interesting. So when you talk about divergence, is it divergence in the minds of the customers or the potential asset owners, or in the minds of market stakeholders?
I think it's those who are providing solutions, because they look at the solution to every, it's like, if you have a hammer, the solution to every problem is a hammer. And so, and I think a lot of the solution providers think, and I'm not saying every single one, but enough of them,
general consensus,
to be a little bit blinkered by their solution being the route to solving the problem. When you speak to a load of other people, if they're all saying something similar, then you go, well, if everyone thinks that their own one is the starting place and right way of doing this, then something isn't quite right here. So there's probably a need for a kind of round table or report or whatever, which ask different stakeholders about their particular view on how they see this, to look at where things converge and where they diverge, because it can't be, the solution can't be always one person's perspective out of all the different
makes sense,
different stakeholders. So there has to, and and in a way you kind of get if you have that situation, you get the penguin around the ice problem, around the hole in the ice problem, which is none of the penguins want to jump into the hole in the ice because they don't want to be eaten by the shark or seal or orca or whatever. But once one jumps in, then they all go, because, and so at the moment, when there isn't this kind of clear way, or kind of at least some common agreement about what is the best way to progress with this, you're getting the thing, there's concern about being the first to jump in and take a risk of it. And I'm not saying people aren't doing it and aren't doing it well, but it's this, given all the talk about retrofitting or brownfield, you're not seeing it in any way near anywhere near in terms of the case studies as you are for new build. I mean, I don't know, based on what I'm seeing and LinkedIn and all the other things, there's not this kind of body of, here's a load of people who have done retrofit, here's how they've done it, here's how they roadmap it, here's how they got the different stakeholders together or whatever. So I think another thing which probably will come back to me about that, which I kind of see as exciting, is I don't know whether it really matters about brown or greenfield, new build or retrofit, but I am seeing this kind of consolidation with master systems integrators, okay, or master systems integration as approach. So if you see a smart building consultant sitting in the middle of the user functionality and the technical foundation, because they're the people who write specifications, whether they're from the original kind of building consultants or the kind of new breed which are emerging out of FMs. They sit there. They're rarely actually involved in deployment, because that's master systems integrators will be, the Tridium resellers, the people who are putting in the ICT infrastructure, the people doing the structured cabling, power over Ethernet and all of those things. They're the people who are building the kind of infrastructure, connecting up, the commissioning of the IT, the issuing of IP addresses for all of the different devices, etc., etc. But I kind of see a lot of those things consolidating. So, and I'm about to share a diagram, which is less about it being a series of layers, devices, network, edge data integration, cloud platform, but more about the players involved in those different things, and the more about how they're starting to cluster. So cloud platform companies are, by virtue of a necessity, because if they want to build for their platform, are often having to become more involved in master systems integration, because otherwise their platform isn't going to be getting the data that they need to be able to show value. So you're kind of seeing those people who do edge device and data integration having to offer merging or with the cloud platform things. Often not because that's what they want to do, because they actually just want to be selling the platform because they have to do that. You're also seeing, the device layer, BMS, OEMs and others doing some of that edge and data integration. And that's not a big surprise because Honeywell owns both Tridium and Trend. So
they would rather do it.
Why wouldn't they be a reseller of those products as well as that? And therefore they're also starting to provide networks as well as part of that. Then you're seeing the kind of people who were the kind of Tridium, Niagara or Trend type resellers also kind of merging with the kind of, so the MSIs and MSPs emerging. So you're seeing a lot of consolidation and fluidity between those different people in that space. And I don't think that's really about new build versus retrofit.
It's just a general move.
It's a general move, and partly because it's about what are the jobs to be done and the problems to be solved and who's got to solve them. Well, often those problems happen at the same time. So, when I first started to come into this space, I kind of saw the network as necessarily being at the heart of this. And I think that's still a really important part of it because it's what connects everything up. But I'm beginning to think on the technological foundation, it might be the asset information model, which is actually at the center of everything, because that tells you exactly what it is that is being connected up. And that's what provides all the data that you're going to have to then analyze or automate. It's also where the cybersecurity threat comes in. So because it's those assets, those devices, which present the new thing, once you start connecting things up, even whether it's an Wi-Fi access point, they all start to prevent cybersecurity risks. So maybe, I don't know if it's the heart, but it's kind of like that's the thing which kind of joins all the things together. And it's kind of interesting if you look at the Smart Score framework, it's almost right in the middle of things too, although they do it in slightly different layer. Their way they structure their kind of key criteria is slightly different. So, even as I look at these things evolve based on more information, and I'm already seeing like that kind of consolidation that I've just described there.
Oh, that's interesting. Interesting. In fact, I did not. So that's obviously a very good takeaway for me. I did not see that coming. The consolidation and sort of movement across the different sort of stakeholders, and one trying to do what the other would do.
Well, look, I mean, it's like all things. Again, it's a bit like I said about, someone buying, an enterprise-wide solution versus, having several SLAs for best of breed platforms. I think it's the same with this. Some people may want a one-stop shop,
Makes
which
sense.
does everything, others are going to want specialists who can do, are going to want
one thing really, really very well, is what they
really
would
well.
want.
And, often that's going to be probably about the size of a project. If it's massive project, you might, you'll probably have budget to be able to, have other people, might not understand why there's so much margin being passed down chains, and might say, well, actually that needs to be consolidated, around, because, we don't want to have all these different contractual issues with all these different people. So I don't think, again, that's going to be determined on lots of different factors and you're seeing that not just in, I think it's because we're linked to construction. So everything I described there is no kind of like, trade secret or anything. It happens within the way that construction companies are now contracted. It's happening in the way that, other people, other stakeholders are being contracted. And, as I said, it's already a kind of consideration within platforms about enterprise wide versus best of breed. So all of those things, and that's what I mean, if you've worked in other industry areas, you start to see patterns of both problems and opportunities.
And this is just an interesting thought coming to my mind when you say about some might want best of breed and some might want something which is generic and probably, let's say, a SPOC that we've defined. I think what we've seen working with facilities management in projects which have been completed, but they could be airports, could be data centers and stuff like that. What we've seen, Justin, is that who is really owning the retrofit? If the retrofit is being owned via the energy side of things, it's often the building services, and they decide what sort of technology enablement need to happen. Because, and I think you quite clearly said that we haven't seen enough of retrofit happen from the perspective where an asset owner is going in and saying, hey, I'm creating an enabling environment where the data would be owned by me, the connectivity would be owned by me. And then, we can, what we offer is connectivity in terms of data reciprocation or insights and stuff like that. So I think that is what's going to decide as to who ends up owning, and which is not the challenge in something that's being built.
Well, look, there's still specifications being issued out there for network refreshes which don't have any thought or provision for how like OT might, or for have anything convergence built into them in any shape or form. There are still fire systems being commissioned, CCT vision, BMS refreshers being commissioned, where there isn't necessarily any thought about wider convergence going on. So and it's interesting because if I've been to a couple of building shows recently, and there's a lot of talk about digital transformation, but not always are they talking about that level of convergence where the IT people are talking to building operations or estate management, and the sustainability team are in the room. So how many companies have put out a specification for, let's say, a network refresh, but also at the same time have committed to 2030, 2040, 2050 and drive to net zero, but haven't made any provision for operational technologies to go in as part of their network refresh, and it's like, well, how do you think you're ever going to get there unless you operationalize your buildings and connect up all your assets? So it's not an attack on those people, but
it's just a suggestion on what you might have to look through.
So basically. I think so there's another part of the jigsaw puzzle that needs to happen, which isn't just like people in the industry kind of coming together to talk more about how this might roll out. It's also from the other side about how people within an organization come together and look like this. And maybe the route into that is via the sustainability people to say, look, if you really are committed to drive towards net zero, then part of what you're going to have to do is get your IT people and building services in the room with you and other stakeholders, probably head of, is it HRCO or CHRO, head
whoever
of
that might be,
head of human resources or whatever, because there's it's also about employee experience, isn't it? The user functionality. So you're probably going to have to get more people in the room as part of what it is that you're trying to do, if you really want to achieve that. And I'm not saying, because, if you look at the stats, and I think we discussed this before, didn't we? That like every single platform provider has the same second slide after their title slide, which is 40% of all emissions from buildings.
No, our slide has 900. There are 900 million non-technical workforces in the operations unit. So,
well
so
done.
we change. No, but
You know what I mean? It's like everyone's
ours,
aware of like how much that
no,
buildings
I have a bad
contribute
sense of
to.
humor, but ours
Yeah.
is the third slide, the 40% one. Now,
Well, I mean, that's my point, really. So
true that.
maybe if we really want that internal education to go on, on the commissioning side, it
Makes sense.
may be, and this is about lateral thinking. And I'm only saying that because before my kind of, smart buildings journey, that's the space I was kind of operating in, more on the communication side. But, already there that you were seeing, the connection between ESG reporting and actually kind of sort of more operational actions, but that was often in large FMCG companies, much more connected around their supply chains, their factories, their processes and things like that. I mean, I very rarely saw, buildings as being like one of the key considerations that they were talking about.
Absolutely. No, I think
and if anything, that's one of the reasons I was really excited to come into the smart building space, because it seemed, given that stat, it seemed like a really tangible place to be in where you could make a difference, basically. Because,
I mean, again, I know we've clearly overshot the time, but I just have to make this one final. You
Sure.
just again said one interesting point, Justin, where you mentioned that because emissions is such a big thing in built environment, that might be the route to bring the stakeholders together, and especially as you read. Yeah. I'll just say this: we wanted to get started at a huge facility in the middle of Middle East, and it's been 3 months we've been figuring out with the IT on the network. So I could not, and it's been like one meeting after the other trying to solve for security, network access, and which are all legitimate, by the way, all legitimate discussions. But as you rightly said, the moment when you have that enabler in the room, which is, let's say that, hey, we are committed to net zero, and that's why it's important, everything works out. But the moment you do not have a driver, it's difficult to get everyone on board in that sense. So you hit the nail on the head there.
And that's also what their job is to do, is to try and bring everyone on board and try and do it. So,
True that.
And so, like, I don't know. I kind of think, there is an education job to be doing. I'm not going to name them, but I think it's part of the process. But, there's a platform provider out there who's got this kind of campaign running at the moment called, like, turn off your bloody lights off. Yeah, and I think, that's part of it, isn't it? Because, like, they are actually highlighting companies who do have.
Well, I think Mike MG would really appreciate if we give him and his company the credit. He was my guest.
I mean, I should do. It's Metricus, because they spoke at the event that they kindly spoke at the event.
And MG was my last. He was one of the guests and absolutely, you simply love that, right? Because a lot of people would be very apprehensive on how you do that campaign. People might get offended and stuff like that. But you really do it. I mean, and I'm hoping that has also got them customers, by the way, which is there. But Justin, thank you so much for taking time out. It's always a pleasure, and I'm sure this is just the start of many conversations, not just between us, but between everyone whoever is motivated about the prospects that happen to be there in this industry. Thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in. Justin, follow him. We'll have the links to his LinkedIn profile. He has amazing, as you have found out from the podcast, thoughts, lateral thinking, and is more importantly, according to me, is wanting to to just have the conversation because it just helps. And then whatever be the outcome is really, really important. So thanks once again, Justin. Really a pleasure talking to you, buddy.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Umesh. It's like really good, and really appreciate the opportunity as much as anything, just to sort of sound out these ideas, because you think about this stuff, and unless you've got a sounding board, you've got no idea about whether it's, you know, makes any sense to anybody else, or you've kind of connected some dots which actually didn't need joining. So hugely appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. In fact, that's another thing. So whoever is listening, please be our sounding board. If you think whatever we've spoken does not make sense or needs to be deliberated more, I'm sure either one of us wouldn't mind having this conversation again, but with you in the realm as well. Thank you so much.